The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Luke. Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do, now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as a manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in their dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord. Today's parable reminds me of the old story about the business manager who was interviewing candidates for an accounting job. "Okay," the manager asked the first applicant, "What's 2 plus 2? 4, the applicant replied. The interview ended right there. Same thing with the next candidate. She said 4, and she was out the door. But the third time was the charm. That applicant got the job. Like the other candidates, he was ushered into the manager's office. The interviewer popped the question, "What's 2 plus 2? The applicant stood up, locked the door, closed the blinds, leaned over the desk, and whispered, "How much do you want it to be?" No offense to accountants, but if you think that that's a groaner, then consider the story Jesus tells us in today's parable. It's been called by lots of names: the parable of the prudent steward, the unjust steward, the shrewd steward, the crooked steward, the dishonest steward. And there are just as many opinions about what it actually means. But I think that this, like all of the parables of Jesus, can be boiled down in essence to 5 simple words. It's all about God's grace. It's all about God's grace. Jesus weighs in frequently on money matters. He speaks of money in about half of the parables attributed to him. And so here's the deal with today's parable. A dishonest manager is about to be fired for squandering his rich employer's property. So he weighs his options. They are slim to none. He isn't strong enough to dig, and he's too proud to beg. So he hatches Plan B. He goes to the rich man's creditors, and he cuts them a deal. From the one who owes 100 jugs of olive oil, he collects only half or 50. So we expect the master to be angry at being cheated. But instead, he praises the steward for being shrewd. What? Run that one by me again? But now, if you remember last week, Jesus was eating with sinners and tax collectors, and the Pharisees were grumbling about it. Well, today they are all still at that table. And so when Jesus gives the disciples a lesson about grace and about mercy, the Pharisees grumble even more. And in fact, the very next verse, right after our gospel lesson ends today, verse 14 says, "The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and sneered at him." They sneered at Jesus. Remember that the Pharisees had turned rule-making and creative bookkeeping into an art form. They deprived their elderly parents of support by declaring it as a gift to God. And as a gift to God, anything that they might have given their parents, they were allowed to keep instead for themselves. The crooked manager sounds like someone they would admire. And then Jesus delivers the point of the parable. No servant can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and wealth. That prompts the sneer. It's the issue at the heart of the Pharisees' callousness. They had successfully compartmentalized their lives. God was over here, and their worldly pursuit of wealth over there. And the two never met, never crossed paths. In his book titled, "I Talk Back to the Devil," A.W. Tozer said that money often comes between us and God. You can take 2 small dimes, he said, and with them shut out a panoramic view. Go to the mountains and hold 2 coins closely in front of both of your eyes. The mountains are still there, but you cannot see them at all because there is a dime shutting off the vision in each eye. It doesn't take a lot of money to come between us and God, he says. Just a little, placed in the wrong position, will effectively obscure our view. And then there is the story that former late-night TV host David Letterman told about a man he met while standing outside of a Las Vegas casino. Please, the man begged him frantically, "Can you spare $500? My wife is very ill. I really need the money to take her to the doctor and to buy her the medicine that she needs." Suspicious, David asks, "Well, if I give you $500, how do I know that you just won't take it and go into the casino and gamble it all away?" The man appeared shocked. "Oh, no," he exclaimed. "I wouldn't do that. I've got gambling money." Sometimes it is difficult to face the fact that we've all been Pharisees, compartmentalizing what we do on Sunday from what we do every other day. We do have bills to pay, college to pay for the kids, retirement savings. We sock away a little for our vacations and even a little more for mad money. It is true that we need money to live, but the danger is of letting it deprive us of the true riches in life. Today's parable is also about the right use of our talents, our energy and skill, and yes, our money as well. But it's also about extravagant love, forgiveness, relationship, God's grace and mercy, and our very lives. In other words, none of us, not the Pharisees, not the disciples, not us, has the right to be in the sin accounting business. Very often, though, that is how we are viewed by contemporary society. I know because I once performed a wedding for a very close friend of mine. And just before the ceremony began, her soon-to-be brother-in-law approached me with a provocative question. Now, mind you, this is a day of feasting and joy and celebration. And he approached me just as the wedding party was lining up and said, "So now, are you going to tell us all that we're going to hell?" Now, it is true that we Christians, we religious folk, seem to be the ones with a tendency to name sins, to categorize, to classify, to sort, even to rank them. But none of us has the right to be in the sin management business. That is, none of us except Jesus. Now, it is true, unfortunately, that for some of us, there are times and there are situations in our lives that we need to protect ourselves and to make sure that we are safe as we work out and we work on the process of forgiveness, which is different from what Jesus is saying in today's parable. In today's gospel, he rejects sin management in favor of mercy, of humility, in favor of God's abundant grace. This is another one of those illogical Jesus lessons that upsets our notions of right and of wrong, especially when what we really want to know is why the rich man doesn't just get rid of the crooked manager right then. Why not call for an independent audit instead of letting this same crooked guy check the books again? Mostly we want to know why the rich man commends the guy who discounts his property. It may help to remember that last week's parables were about the lost sheep and the lost coin, whose owners drop everything else they are doing and make finding them, rescuing them, the number one priority. And in between those stories is this other parable, the one about the prodigal son, the son who demands his inheritance and then squanders it all on women and fast living and loses his senses altogether. But when he comes to himself, grace and his father's extravagant love bring him home again. And that's what today's parable ultimately is all about. Why forgive anyone who sinned against us or against our sense of what is right? Why forgive the debts of debtor nations? There are dozens of great reasons, but the only one that really matters to us as Christians is because that's what Jesus calls upon us to do. Because it is true that most of the time, we really are not all that good at forgiving. Sometimes we say we will forgive somebody, but first we want them to confess, to be penitent, to make amends. And if we do decide then to forgive them, we aren't necessarily going to forget about it anytime soon, if ever. And the truth is that it isn't our forgiveness we're talking about. It belongs to God. It's God's unconditional grace, mercy, and love. It's what we are called to do because it is what Jesus did for us. We ourselves are the forgiven. And when we forgive, when we offer grace to others, it brings us more deeply in touch with God's life, with God's abundant grace. Where in your life do you desire mercy and grace? When have you been surprised by unearned grace? To whom might you offer it? When have you loved extravagantly or forgiven much when you just did not want to? Where have you reached out or inward or dug way down deep to give when you just did not feel like doing it? If nothing else, the manager is shrewd enough to know three things. that time is of the essence, that money is just a means, not an end, and that the mercy of his master is his only hope. Dependent upon each, he takes risks with each. Theologian William Barclay sums up what this all means when he says, if only the Christian was as eager and ingenious in his attempt to attain goodness as the person of the world is in their attempt to attain money and comfort, the Christian would be a much better person. A parishioner once told me that she had decided to study the Bible as thoroughly and with as much effort as she had studied for her real estate license a few years earlier. When I began to put that much effort into it, she told me, the Bible came alive for me. I've grown so much and I've understood so much since. By the way, that is a wonderful spiritual discipline. A challenge. Try reading the Bible every day. Do it for a month, and then notice how the words have changed for you. Notice how your view of your life circumstances have changed for you. Notice how you have changed. One of the heroes in my life was Malcolm Boyd, who until his death last year was poet in residence of our diocese. During his lifetime, Malcolm was called a lot of different things. He was called the celebrity priest because he had been friends with Mary Pickford and other Hollywood royalty. He was called the beatnik priest for doing church in coffee houses, and that was long before there was ever anything known as the emergent church. When he participated in freedom rides in the Deep South in the 1960s, he became known as the rebel priest. And later, after going public about his sexuality, he was called the gay priest. And as he grew older, he chronicled his conversations with God and with aging and with grace and with the next great adventure, death, and what lies beyond it. I've seen people testify about what Malcolm's courage has meant for them. It gave them back their lives. It brought them to and kept them in the Episcopal Church, in this church. The way Malcolm lived his life, he made a space for grace. And that is what today's parable is all about. That is what we are all called to do, to give whenever and however and as much as we are able, because it really is all about God's grace. Amen.